What first appeared to be a devastating house explosion in North London would soon become something far more sinister. In the early morning hours of June 17, 2025, residents of a quiet neighborhood in Stoke Newington were startled awake by a massive explosion. The blast was so powerful that neighbors later described it as feeling like an earthquake. Windows rattled, homes shook. People rushed outside to see smoke, fire, and debris filling the street. At first, emergency responders believed they were dealing with a tragic gas explosion. But as firefighters worked through the damaged property, they uncovered evidence that would completely change the direction of the investigation. Inside the home was 46-year-old Annabel Rook, and investigators would soon determine that Annabel had not died in the explosion. She had already been killed. The man accused of her murder was someone who had shared years of her life, her longtime partner, Clifton George. What followed was an investigation that revealed a history of control, violence, and a desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of a brutal crime. But to understand how investigators reached that conclusion, it's important to understand who Annabel Rook was long before her name appeared in newspaper headlines. Friends described Annabel as compassionate, intelligent, and deeply committed to helping others. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and perhaps most notably, she was a charity founder whose work focused on helping vulnerable women rebuild their lives. Annabel co-founded Mama Sue's, an organization dedicated to supporting women facing hardship, including survivors of domestic abuse, sexual violence, displacement, and exploitation. Those who knew her said she had an extraordinary ability to make people feel seen, to make them feel safe. Many women credited Annabel with helping them regain confidence after experiencing trauma. She spent years helping others navigate some of the darkest moments of their lives, which makes what happened to her all the more heartbreaking. According to prosecutors, the relationship between Annabel and Clifton George had become increasingly troubled. Court testimony would later reveal allegations of controlling behavior, intimidation, and emotional abuse. Friends told investigators that Annabel often appeared stressed and anxious. Some described her as feeling trapped. Others recalled conversations in which she expressed concern about George's behavior. As time passed, prosecutors say Annabel began considering a future without him. Evidence presented at trial suggested she wanted the relationship to end and wanted George to move out of the home they shared. For many people, the end of a relationship is painful, but prosecutors argued that for George, Annabel's desire to leave represented something far more threatening, a loss of control. And according to the Crown's case, that loss of control ultimately turned deadly. On the evening of June 16, 2025, the couple were inside their Stoke Newington home. Exactly what was said between them that night may never be fully known, but investigators believe an argument erupted, and that argument escalated into violence. The evidence presented in court painted a horrifying picture. Annabel was assaulted. There was evidence of strangulation. Then came the knife attack. Medical experts testified that Annabel suffered numerous stab wounds. Reports varied on the exact number, with some accounts citing 22 stab wounds and others describing more than 30 separate injuries. Among them was a fatal wound to the heart. The attack was severe. It was sustained, and prosecutors argued it demonstrated a clear intention to kill. By the end of the assault, Annabel Rook was dead inside her own home. For many murder investigations, that would have been the end of the timeline. But in this case, investigators say the killer wasn't finished. Hours later, a second act would unfold, one that would transform the crime scene into a disaster zone, and sent shockwaves through an entire neighborhood. According to prosecutors, sometime after Annabel was killed, Clifton George set into motion a plan that would make the case international news. Authorities say he caused a gas explosion inside the property. The blast ripped through the home with tremendous force. Walls collapsed, windows shattered, debris was thrown across the surrounding area. Neighboring properties also sustained damage. Residents who had been sleeping only moments earlier suddenly found themselves running into the street in confusion and fear. Some believed a vehicle had crashed into a building. Others feared a terrorist attack. No one knew that a homicide had already taken place inside the home. When emergency responders arrived, they discovered George outside the property. He had suffered injuries in the explosion. According to court testimony, he was found in the garden area near the damaged home. But what happened next immediately caught investigators' attention. Prosecutors said George told emergency personnel that Annabel was inside and that he had killed her. That statement changed everything. What had begun as a fire and explosion investigation instantly became a potential murder scene. The challenge facing investigators was enormous. The explosion had damaged critical evidence. Fire had altered parts of the scene. Structural instability made portions of the property dangerous to enter. Yet detectives, forensic specialists, and fire investigators worked together to reconstruct the final hours of Annabel's life. As evidence was collected and analyzed, a disturbing picture emerged. Investigators concluded that the explosion occurred after Annabel's death. The blast had not caused the homicide. Instead, prosecutors argued it was an attempt to destroy evidence and conceal what had happened. As detectives dug deeper, they began examining the couple's relationship history. Phone records, messages, witness interviews, personal communications. All of it became part of the effort to understand motive. Friends and family described a relationship that had become increasingly unhealthy. Witnesses recounted concerns about George's behavior. Prosecutors argued that Annabel had been trying to separate herself from him and reclaim control over her own future. That evidence would become a cornerstone of the case presented to the jury. The case eventually went before a jury at Snaresbrook Crown Court. There, prosecutors laid out their theory of what happened. They argued that George murdered Annabel during a violent confrontation and then caused the explosion afterward. George admitted responsibility for Annabel's death. However, he denied murder. Instead, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter and admitted causing the explosion. His defense centered on the claim that he had lost control. But prosecutors argued the evidence told a different story. They pointed to the nature of the injuries. They pointed to the actions taken after the killing. And they pointed to the broader history of the relationship. Jurors listened to weeks of testimony. They heard from experts, investigators, witnesses, and those who knew Annabel best. Ultimately, the jury rejected George's explanation. He was found guilty of murder. He was also convicted of arson with intent to endanger life. For Annabel's family, the verdict represented accountability, but it could never undo the loss. In statements following the trial, loved ones focused on who Annabel was rather than the violence that took her life. They remembered a woman who dedicated herself to helping others, a woman whose work changed lives, a woman whose compassion extended far beyond her own circle. One of the most striking aspects of this case is the tragic irony at its center. Annabel spent years helping women recover from abuse and trauma. Yet prosecutors say she ultimately became the victim of the very type of violence she worked so hard to fight against. Her story serves as a reminder of the dangers that can arise when abusive relationships reach a breaking point. It also highlights the courage often required to leave situations marked by control and intimidation. Today, Clifton George stands convicted. Annabel Rook's family continues to honor her legacy, and a case that began with a mysterious explosion now stands as a murder investigation that revealed far more than damaged property. Beneath the rubble was the story of a life dedicated to helping others, a life cut short by violence, and a jury's decision that justice demanded accountability. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. And as always, remember the victim's name, Annabel.